All
right. So, what is NSUserDefaults?
A user default.
I hope that's not what you wrote.
Shit.
What is NSUserDefaults and why do we need it? Every one of you,
It's a dictionary.
minus Levi apparently, should have had a lot of experience with this on their homework assignment, since that was 100% what your homework assignment was to use.
Built-in dictionary user storage.
Persistent user storage. Okay, fair enough.
How persistent user settings, something like that.
So essentially, it's a dictionary that persists through multiple runs of your application, right? Allowing you to throw data into it so they stay there, so that it stays there. So every single time you run your application, you can pull the data back out, right? All right. So the end of class last time we were demoing this, so I created a little variable called current count. We put a count in there. If count was equal to nil, I started off at 0. Otherwise, I printed it out. I added 1 to it, storing the result back in there, proving that we could remember that count each time we ran the application. Last time we ran it, it was a 6. Next time we run it here, it should be a 7. There's our 7, so on and so forth. Okay? Now, as our application currently stands, when we add a role, so we do a D6 or something like that, quantity 4, we put this guy back here. Okay, and we don't have it actually rolling yet, but the idea is we want to be able to have these things persist, because if I run my program again right now, I've lost that 4D6. I'm back to an empty application. Make sense? All right, so we'd like to be able to remember those things. So let's go and look where we're storing them now. So right now we are storing those guys in, let's see, here's my code behinds, that's our support. So quantity select screen, when we do add role button, well, every single time we change the picker value, we're updating a value in dice roller core. All right, and what we did is we set a Boolean value up there called diceRollerCore.hasDice to true. So that gets set to true so that when we activate back in our main screen, we'll activate, we ask, is there a new dice? If there is, we're going to go ahead and append that new dice as a role. Append that dice as a role to our the roles method for our dice roller. Then we call reset values up there, which should set num sides, num dice back to -1 or wherever we had it, and set also has where's the back to has dice back to false. So num sides is 0, num dice is 1, has sides is false. That's what we do when we reset. All right. So right now, the value of this global variable, the roles, is our roles in our application, right? So what would happen if we tried to store just that array? That array entirely houses our roles, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, main screen, will activate. We're going to go ahead and we're going to grab var the roles is equal to actually, we'll just do it the very first time, not in will activate. We'll do it in did load. So here's our preferences. So I'll go ahead and we'll let the roles equal prefs dot value for key, and let's just call it the roles. Then we'll say if the roles is not equal to nil. If it actually has a real value, then we'll say, what is it called? Dice roller core dot the roles is equal to the roles. We'll overwrite that global guy with that. Go ahead and get rid of this stuff. All right. Assign value of any object up. As NSArray. That guy's going to come out as an NSImmutable array. Okay, if I want to turn it into an actual mutable array, so first of all, question, how many of you experimented with storing arrays in NSUserDefaults? All right, what did we find out when you were using arrays in NSUserDefaults? It stores
Well, it stores it.
immutable ones, right? So anything you put into NSUserDefaults, it stores them in a non-changeable way. When it comes out, it also stores it as a non-changeable way. All right, so when it comes out, it's going to be an NSArray. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to set my roles equal to an NSMutable array built with an NSArray. And that NSArray is going to be called the roles. So this will copy everything over, and now I have a mutable array. What does that mean for an array to be mutable? That would have made a good quiz question as well. Changeable. We can update stuff. NSArrays are read-only. NSMutable arrays are read-write. Okay?
What is it, thread safe?
Huh?
Is it thread safe?
No.
Do we have thread safe arrays?
Yes, I'm trying to think which. I don't think it's actually technically an array. I think they're called NS, so the NS vectors.
Well, we don't have like.
You'd have to, worst case, you write your own synchronized
we have
functions.
synchronized or asynchronous?
Yeah. All right, so let's see, what is this guy complaining about?
What's the difference between value for key and object for key?
Who?
You can, from prefs, you can get value for key or object for key.
Oh, well, let's find out. Prefs.value for key always returns an any object. Object for key also returns an any object. First occurrence is specified default. Returns the value of the property identified by a given key. Value for key assumes that there's only, well, I'm guessing, one copy. Object for key looks for the first occurrence. Oh, that's actually interesting. You can get a mutable. That's interesting. Yeah, that would be my best guess at this point. They from our perspective, they seem like they're equivalents. Okay, so I can't ask if that guy is nil, so what I'll do is I'll ask if that guy is nil. Then I'll grab this guy as an NSArray. The rows.
You have to go into the dice roller core and change it to accept NS mutable arrays.
What do I have it set as now?
I don't remember.
I have it set up as a mutable. This is a mutable array.
Want some blending or something?
Clearly. It's not going to work anyways. I just want to show you how it's not going to work.
Can you cast it as roles array?
NSArray should be an NSArray.
No, I mean the mutable array as roles. Like just throw another cast and all the way at the end.
Of this guy?
Yeah.
But it's not
No,
as...
like cast the mutable array to as roles.
But it's not an as. You mean like this as roles like this?
Something like that, yeah. Or role. Like,
Oh, we call it just roll.
the word.
No, it says it.
It
says it all.
So
All right, hold on.
technically,
Let me do it.
Always fails.
Here, we'll just do it this way because it'll work okay for us
I don't know what you're talking about.
to prove the situation. So I'm going to say dice roller core dot the rolls is equal to the rolls as a NS mutable array. Is that going to let me get away with it? So the problem is, was your array stored as roles or just strings? Did you have role objects for your array or just strings that you stored? I'm talking
Oh,
directly
me?
to you.
Oh, I.
You're just like over here, like, oh.
Actually, I did mine.
You do yours completely different?
Yeah.
All right.
Here, that's how
Well, I just need to know the answer to that
I did
question.
mine as NSArray, and then I cast it to an int array because I stored all mine as int array.
Okay, yeah. So you didn't use yours. So punchline here is, let me show it this way. When this guy comes out, first of all, I need to, let's store it first. Well, this guy will come out as an any object. What we're going to put in there is our array of
So if you change,
role objects.
so
all right.
that's a mutable array. So if you
Yeah,
change
give me a second.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to store this. The issue we have here is NSUserDefaults does not let us store anything. Okay? Well, it doesn't let us store everything. That's the better way of saying it. All right, well, it's a significantly better way of saying it. There are certain types of things that it does not know how to store. Certainly, we could consider that a role like this is probably one of those things. Make sense? Because we invented it. That's something that was not already in existence. So what we're going to do here is we're going to, and so that's the issue we're having. It doesn't know how to convert something that isn't a role back into a role. All right, so it knows how to store NS arrays. It actually appears like it knows how to store mutable arrays now. That was not the case before. So we'll look at that here in a second. But at the very least, we can, since I didn't show you that before, let's go ahead and store it as a normal array, but we need to store it as an array of something that's already built into the language. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into role, and we're going to add a function here. And this function is going to be called toString. Okay, going to be called toString. And so let's do this. We're going to say func toString, and this guy's going to return a string. Specifically, the string this guy's going to return is let's do quantity followed by a colon followed by num size. All right, so now we can build, or we can ask a role to give us the string version of itself. All right, so I want you to see what that looks like. So let's go back out here to main screen, and let's forget about this for right now. We'll still store the preferences, but we're not going to do anything with it yet. I'll just comment it out for a second. All right, so then down here, whenever we're activating, if we have dice, we're updating this guy. Now, what I'm going to do is every single time we update it, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to print the contents of that array as strings. Okay, so I'm going to say for var I is equal to 0, I is less than dice roller core dot the rolls dot count I plus plus, and each time through I'm going to go ahead and say print dice roller core dot the rolls at bucket I dot toString, proving that our roles now know how to output themselves as strings. Okay. So we'll go ahead and we'll add a roll in. We'll do 4d6 or whatever I happen to randomly click on. Add roll 4. Well, I actually did d4, whatever. So we'll add that roll. Let's add another one, d6. 7 of those. Go back here. This was the first time it printed. This was the second time it printed. It printed the 2. 6:4, 7:6. Make sense? All right, so I'm representing my dice as strings. All right, now what we want to see is, can I store an array of strings? So what we're going to do here is inside of main screen, we'll activate. When we come back here, every single time that we get a new dice, we're going to go ahead and we're going to say var, let's just call it the dice strings, is equal to a string array. Each time through, rather than printing out the string version of this, we're going to go ahead and we're going to add the string version of this, the dice string. What should we call it? Let's call it the dice strings. Dot. Let me just steal this here. And this is going to want to be a let. Dot append. And we're going to append the string version of the current roll. Oh, so that is changing it. So we do have to call the var. All right. So we filled up that string. Now what we're going to do is we're going to update our preferences with this guy. So I'm going to grab our preference link. I will say prefs dot, what is it? Set object. And the object we're going to set is going to be the dice strings for key, the dice strings. All right. Now I think I can actually print the dice strings here as well. Let's just prove that that's the case. Make sure that it looks right there. And then what we're going to do is up here in, let's do this line. In awake, we'll get our prefs, and we'll say var the dice strings is equal to prefs dot, is it object for key the dice strings, or value for key. Is that the one I showed you, value for key? All right. So that guy will come out of there, and then let's just go ahead and we're going to say if the dice strings is not equal to nil, then print the dice strings as, I'm going to say NSArray for right now. All right, so when we first open our application, we'll try to grab an object named the dice strings, except I need to spell it right. The dice strings. If it's not equal to nil, that means it must really have a value. I'll just display it to the screen. I think the print function knows how to give a rudimentary display of an array of strings. I think it'll kind of show it in some sort of format that we can read. Every single time we add something, when we come back to will activate, if we have a new dice, we'll go ahead and append that roll. Then I'm going to go through, I'm going to build a new array called the dice strings. The dice strings is going to be an array of strings. And I'll go ahead and fill that guy up with the string version of each of my actual rolls. Then I'm going to print it out, so we'll see if it gives us a reasonable format. And then I'll go ahead and store it. Okay, so let's see how this ends up working. So add roll, D6, 11. All right, so there's our dice rolls, 11, 6. We'll add something else, D8, a lot of them. All right, there's our second dice rolls. All right, so now we've stored two things in there, and we've tried to store it persistently inside of our NSUserDefaults. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this again. And when we come into Awake with Context, the very first time through, we're going to try to grab the dice strings. As long as it's not equal to nil, which it shouldn't be, we're going to try to print it out. There's our value. Make sense? So it kept the value. But now, wait a minute. This looks a little different than what we were dealing with before. The old representation of our dice string, which was a NS mutable array, looked like one thing. This guy looks like something else. Actually, what does this look like? What format does that look like it's in, ish? List is fair enough. Looks like JSON, but without the dictionary connections. Okay, so JSON-ish as opposed to.
Doesn't Swift have built-in JSON classes?
It does. Yeah, we'll end up using them. All right, not for this, but we will end up using them. All right, so now we got strings back, right? It seemed like those values persisted. Now let's see if I can go through it. I can get this in such a way that I can build up. I can walk through these. So let's try to print them one at a time. Okay, so we're going to say var vals is equal to this guy as an NSArray. Then let's say for s. Let's see, is that how it works? Is it var s? For var s in vals. Let's print s. Make that a let. Is it just s? For s in vals? I guess that's the for each loop representation in Swift. So we're hoping we can get 11.6 and 42.8 on their own lines. Run it again. And there's our 11.6 and 42.8. So we have a real-to-life mutable or real-to-life NS array. Okay, not a mutable array, but an NS array. Now, if you didn't do it this array version, you could have built up a giant scary string, right? A big string that was a representation of all your roles, and then split them on commas, maybe, something like that. How many of you did something along those lines? Where you stored one value a gigantic string and then parsed it.
I still didn't do that. I shouldn't.
You did two integers. That's fine.
I had two
Yeah.
integers.
And that was the point. Anything you can do to represent your values overruns your application. But I'm showing you how to do it in an array fashion here. But we still had to drop down and do this in a way that was compatible with our.
I did two integer arrays.
So let me show you this here real quick. I'm going to go and do this. So we don't need to print that anymore. So we're building our strings. Here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to store our other guy. So I'm going to try to store the, what was it called? Core, dice roller core dot the rolls. Try to store this in something called the rolls. All right, so that should at least go in. So every single time we update the rolls, we'll overwrite this global variable called the rolls equal to the current version of the rolls. Now let's try to grab that. Okay, I'm not going to try to do anything fancy with it. I'm just going to say print the rolls. And we'll see what it thinks that guy looks like. All right, go ahead and run this. We'll add a roll. 1406. All right, right off the bat. Let's look at the error we get. Attempt to insert non-property list object dice roller.watchKit extension.roll. So fancy schmancy way of saying Apple didn't build it, you can't store it. All right. Now, having said that, you can actually turn your things into property lists, but there becomes a point where you need to, if you're storing sufficiently complex data, maybe you don't use NSUserDefaults, but for what we're doing here, NSUserDefaults is pretty helpful. But the point is we couldn't just store this as its current self. We would have had to turn it into a property list, which means it would have had to match up to a certain protocol. Ultimately being able to display itself or store itself in JSON. So we can't do this, won't let us store something that's of the wrong type, which means that taking it out of there isn't going to help us. So that's why we need to deal with it in terms of strings. But we want to then be able to turn those strings back into roll objects. All right? Which means we need to be able to build our roll objects. So let's go back to roll. Now our rolls know how to convert themselves to strings, but we're going to add a second constructor that takes in a string, and we can build a roll object out of a string. So we'll say init, call this guy a roll string of type string. All right, and we're going to attempt to set the quantity and the number of sides based on the roll string that was passed in. So we're going to say var parts is equal to roll string dot components separated by string, and what do we have in there? A colon? Yep, colon. So that should give us an NSArray. All right, and then we'll say, I think we stored the quantity first. Yep, so we'll say self.quantity is equal to parts at bucket 0, and we want the integer version of that. And I'm going to turn this into a let because it's going to scream at me. Then we'll say self.numSides is equal to the integer version of part 1. And then we have to hold on. That's not the optional. This guy is the, is it gonna work? Which part is it? Value of optional type int question mark. Oh, this guy comes out as an optional, so we need to say that this guy is real. All right, so we'll split that string on the colon, grab the integer version of the first part, which should be the quantity, 11. Grab the integer part of bucket 1, which should be the number of sides, 6, and store them in our variables. All right, then we need to add those values to the roles. So we'll come back into main screen. So after we've gotten our dice strings, and after we have grabbed each string from there, rather than printing that string out, we want to add that string to our dice roller core.theroles.append. What do we want to append? We want to append a role built with a role string. What string? String S. And it's going to say that, is it? Oh, it thinks S is an any object. Oh, okay. So as string. All right. So we've already proven that we can store arrays of strings. We've seen those persist through multiple runs of our application. So now we're going to take that array of strings. We're going to, as long as it actually exists, we're going to go through there. We'll grab the array, go through every string in the array. S in this case is actually an any object. That's why I had to turn it into a string here. We know it's a string. It came out as an any object. So each time through, we're going to go to our global, the roles, and we're going to append a brand new role object built using our new constructor we just wrote called role string that takes in that string as a parameter. All right, so right now we're remembering two things. So when we first launch our application and awake with context comes up, we grab the string array, we go through each of those strings, turn it into a role, add it to our roles. Make sense? So now the hope is, and where does generate table get called here? That gets called down here in, actually it should get called the very first time. No, it doesn't. So if we run this right now, nothing's going to show up on the screen. All right, so we know those things read in, but we never actually generated our table. All right, so before we go on, what we need to do is inside of this, if we actually have something to generate, self.generate table. So we'll generate our table under the circumstance when we launch our application and we actually have old dice strings. And there's our 14d6. Is that all we added? 14d6? I had two things in there. Well, we may not have. Here, let's just add another roll. We'll do 2d6. Now let's launch this again. Yeah, I must have only had two things in there. Or I overwrote it somewhere in the back end. Maybe one of those times where I was adding and removing something, I overwrote it with a blank one. Here, we can prove it real quick to make sure. So if you ever are wondering about your data, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do reset content and settings on our simulator. So that'll get rid of any stuff we've stored in NSUserDefaults. So now I'll go ahead and run this again. Should be blank the first time.
Yeah, it's really blank.
I've broken it. Let's try launching that simulator again. It's funny. So
Is
let's.
it trying to read from a settings file that doesn't exist?
I don't think so. I think Xcode, since we reset the settings in the middle of it, I think Xcode just flipped out.
It does have.
Because we broke the. Is this it?
So is this a runtime error, or is this Xcode just being...
Well, that's a good question. See if we get the same error again. It looks like we are.
Open error. So that means it's trying to open a file that doesn't exist?
Main screen launches. We grab the preferences. We try to grab a value from there. That value should be nothing.
Did you set breakpoints?
Yeah. Yeah, if you want to. Haven't I shown that in here already? I think so.
Yeah.
Didn't we did breakpoints in here?
At least, well, I know me and you
All
have
right.
breakpoint.
Yeah, so if you're ever wondering what, so I'm going to go ahead and just set a breakpoint here. You just click out here to go till you get the dark blue, and you run your program, and it will run up to that point. Let's see if we're at least getting there. Yeah, we're not even getting there. We're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. We're going to reset that again. Then we're going to go here, and we're going to clean the product. Then we'll try to relaunch it.
Yeah, my bad. That's doing something.
All right. Yeah, that I'm guessing it's because we reset the settings when it was running before, and we broke Xcode or broke Apple. I think we broke Apple. All right. So, anyways, it's blank right now. Let's go ahead and add a roll. We'll do 8d6. So that's there. We'll add another roll. Let's do 2d12. Go ahead and launch the application again. Should remember those two.
Should reset it right now.
So there's our two rolls. Make sense? All right, so we forced, we kind of leveraged this idea that our roles, role objects couldn't be stored using NSUserDefaults, which we didn't necessarily talk about last time, but we didn't have to. I showed you how to store integers, right? Okay. So you could have probably extrapolated and tried to store strings. So what I would have expected most of you to do is probably build a giant string of our roles. So 8d6, 2d12, you probably would have represented something like this. The string 8 colon d6 comma 2 colon d12, something like that. Just store that string in NSUserDefaults. Then when you read it back in, split it on the comma, split it on the colon, build your dice objects from that, so on and so forth. All right, so now our application remembers crap for multiple roles. Last thing we need to do here is we need to be able to click on one of these things and actually have it do that role. correct? All right, so that's going to be responding to a button click, which we've done before, and we can add that in fairly easily. But now my question for you is, if I want to name these guys, so I want each of my rows here to have a name. So maybe this is my damage roll, or maybe this is my sword damage roll, this is my range damage roll, something like that. So I'm putting this in context of like Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so I'd like to give these guys an actual name, not just a number of sides and a number of dice. How would we go about naming something?
After you select like the dice or the dice and the number rolls, you could just add a second screen so you select the kind of or the kind of roll it is.
Okay, well, how are you going to enter that kind of roll? Now we got to start thinking about proper problem solving on a watch. So we're not popping up a QWERTY keyboard on the watch, right?
I was just setting like default buttons, so like your like pretty much a list of all.
Okay, give them a list of stuff.
It has a bunch of images, like one's a sword, one's a bow and arrow, and
Yeah,
an image
like
next to the number.
Okay, so we could do it kind of with emoji type stuff, right?
Yeah.
All right.
Your goat attack.
That's right. This is the goat attack. Okay, so we could do it with stuff like that. What else?
Do voice input.
Possibly voice input. Then we have to look at how can we actually talk to the watch as input and have it turn into text. Well, that works for sending messages and stuff like that, but does Apple Watch support that? Okay. Secondarily, are there third-party options for doing that? Okay. Apple Watch sort of kind of supports it, but there are third-party APIs that allow you to do voice dictation type stuff, being able to speak to it. Make sense? Make it talk. All right. So for next class, I want you to research how do we do voice dictation on the Apple Watch using either built-in APIs or a third-party API. Having said that, if you're going to suggest a third-party API, so we're making a recommendation. So our goal is we'd like to be able to speak the type of, this is my initiative roll or something like that. We'd like to speak initiative roll and have it read in that string, and we want to be able to store that. All right? So I don't care how long it is. Whatever, if you want to do it as a bulleted list or something, that's fine. But research how we can get voice input into our application where it's ultimately converted as text, either using Apple's built-in APIs or, if you think there's a better way, a third-party option. If there's a third-party option, tell me what the pros and cons are of it, costs, that kind of stuff. Make sense? All right. So, and then we'll go ahead and we'll connect our buttons up next time, or I'll do it before class.
Is a third-party option buying Google and using their...
Maybe using Google's API if it supports it.
Buying Google in general and just stealing...
Probably not an acceptable third-party option.
But you just said the cost. I'm sure it's...